and welcome to Rolling with Two. I'm Will, and with me as always is the stop buying the cards messing up my strategy,
Sarah.
And today we're doing a two-player perspective and review of Dominion. Like, all of it.
Like everything. This is the Dominion family.
Yes. Sarah, tell us a little bit about the Dominion family.
All right. So, in Dominion, players are monarchs trying to build the best kingdom through buying cards that they add to their deck and trying to be the most efficient and score the most points. So, Will, how do the rules change for two players?
So for two players, you do not have a Nanobot. However, this game has been out long enough that I'm pretty sure someone put out a Nanobot Atama for the game. But when it comes to the actual rules, you'll have victory card piles, and the number of victory cards used changes for two players. It goes down to 8.
Yes.
Instead of, if you're saying playing a 4-player game, you use 12, that sort of thing.
Right.
Otherwise, that's really the only change.
Yep, that is the only change. Everything else is the same, whether you're playing 3 or 4 players, or the ancient mythical 5 or 6 player game. Yeah, there's a reason they took that out.
Okay.
All right, so let's take a look at some issues that may exist in a 2-player experience. For some of the cards that have player interaction, they don't feel as effective in a 2-player game.
Yeah, and the thing is, whenever they do an effect, an attack effect, the idea is slow down the opponent, maybe speed you up.
Right.
So that essence is still there. It's just if you're in a 4-player game, you see it affecting a wide swath of people. So it feels very powerful, whereas in a 2-player game, it's just her.
And it can feel very binary, because if you have an attack card, and let's say Will buys 1, well, I can buy 1. And if we play it the same number of times and have the same effect, it's a wash. It feels almost useless. I mean, attack cards generally slow the game down, which is generally not a good thing. And if the effect in the end is a net sum 0, it's not as good. Plus, in later expansions, there are some attacks that have choices. And so just having more opponents with that option, it feels better.
Yeah, but that's more of a hypothetical feeling sort of experience.
Right.
It doesn't actually affect gameplay in such a way where it breaks it for a 2-player game.
No, and I would say more is that when you're playing 2 players and you have a lot of attack cards, it just really ramps up that head-to-head feeling. If you like that, that's great. If you don't like that, it's not so great. Or
don't play with those cards.
Right, and that's the great thing about Dominion. You just don't have to play with attack cards, so you don't have to play with any negative player interaction cards. Now, there are cards in here that have positive player interactions, that you get a big effect and everybody else at the table draws a card. That actually feels better at a 2-player, because again, you have fewer options. I mean, fewer opponents, so not as many people are drawing cards, or you only got one person who's drawing a card when you get to do something really awesome. So it's an issue, but it can also not be an issue. But it is something to consider depending on how you like your 2-player games.
Right.
Then the only other thing, this we actually have straddling both a good and a negative thing. I mean, good and negative. So let's start with the negative and then we'll move into the positive. And that is, you have less time between turns. And the negative aspect of that is, this is a game that you can get to the mid part of the game and you have a lot of options to consider. So you actually need more time to think about how you're going to play your next turn. If you have a 4-player game, generally speaking, you don't usually have to pay too much attention to what other people are doing. If they do an attack, believe me, they're going to tell you, hey, take a curse card or whatever. But otherwise, generally speaking, you can just look through your cards and figure out what you're going to do. In a 2-player game, you just don't have as much time to do that.
Yeah. So, on the positive side, it's your turn again.
Yes.
Whatever that other person did, okay, well, at least it's your turn again. So, get back to thinking, about what you're going to do. Hopefully, if, say, what you were struggling with is I'd start thinking, figure out what I wanted to do, had some time to consider it, and then get back to it. Well, with the plays coming one right after another, maybe you don't even lose that groove that you get into.
Right, especially if you get to a point where I'm going to play a card that draws cards. You may not want to plan past that point because you might want to see, well, what you actually draw. So again, it's a positive and a negative, and it's all depending on the circumstances. A 2-player game definitely goes a lot faster than a 4-player game just because there's fewer people taking turns. But again, that might mean your turn takes longer as you think about it. But in general, this game does take a bit more time just because of some expansions being more complicated than others and having a lot to think about.
Yeah. So another benefit of 2 players is considering, well, you don't have the time to think the most efficiently about it. The nice thing is there's less competition over the stacks because on most games, aside from victory point cards, you have 10 cards in a given pile.
Yeah.
And in a 4-player game, and if it's a very popular card, you might be lucky to get 3 cards.
Sometimes you're lucky if you get 1 or 2.
Depending on what the effect is.
Right.
Because sometimes the card can get itself. So for a 2-player game, there's a lot more chances for you to have a lot more instances of that card making its way into your deck. So there's a bit of forgiveness, I would say.
Yes, there's definitely that, oh, I should have bought that card, but, well, hopefully I'll have enough money to buy it on my next turn. In a 2-player game, you're more likely to be able to do that because you have fewer people competing over the same strategies. And again, that's just in a 4-player game. If you do a random setup, sometimes you might only have 1 or 2 clear paths to victory. And that means everybody's going to recognize it and going to go after those cards. In a 2-player game, even if both players are playing the same strategy, it's still not going to roll out exactly the same. But you have, like you said, more forgiveness in that opportunity to buy that card you want.
Yep, because next turn, maybe.
Yeah.
And next turn is here.
Yep, that's true. So that wraps up the good and the bad for the 2-player experience. So let's move on to accessibility. This is a very heavy text reading game. If you have, well, even if you don't have the older version, some of the older versions, older editions, I should say, the text is kind of on the smaller side and the backgrounds are a bit darker. The newer printings do a better job of having larger font, at least, and tried to do better contrast, but not all of them. But let's stick on the heavy text reading, Will, you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, so in addition to what's on the cards, there's also the flavor text in the rules. It's just like number of paragraphs that it's sad that a lot of people just skip over, which is a shame because that's where a lot of the theming comes from and gives context to how to play this. Because a lot of people, if you ask Dominion, like, no theme. I disagree.
We both disagree.
Yes. So in order to help that, we have planned out a series we call Board Game Theater, in which I dress up all fancy-like and perform the flavor text of that given installment. In addition, we will also do a secondary video where we talk more specifically about that installment because, as you can tell, doing an entire video about all 15 installments currently of the game may not be helpful right now because you can't necessarily afford it or don't have the room for it or just not interested in certain ones. So that's where we'll actually break those down individually as well as provide you a little bit of accessibility by performing the flavor text.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun to make, and we hope you all enjoy. There'll be, like I said, the Will's performance, and the other video will go over the mechanisms in that particular expansion and who we think that expansion would be best for. Because, yeah, unless you're like, well, I mean, we are kind of Dominion nuts. We love Dominion, so we will always buy everything for Dominion, and we've tried to get like all the promos and things like that. But that's not for everybody, and we completely understand that. And so some expansions speak to people in different ways. So we'll look forward to those videos coming out by the week.
Yes. Speaking of expansions, that leads us to a different part of the accessibility issue, where color borders.
Yes. So your basic action is white, and that's great because, well, you got black text and it's white. Now, the downside is they do kind of a, what do you call it? Not canvas. I'm sorry, a parchment.
Yeah.
Parchment looking background. So it's not completely solid. Like I said, the newer printings do a little bit better job. But when you get to the reaction cards, which are more numerous because they've been in the game since the very beginning, you can maybe hopefully tell from here that this is a very dark blue border. It's really hard to read black on a dark blue border. That is also a parchment background. And even the text box, they colored it slightly blue as well. So that makes it really difficult to read. In Nocturne, they introduced purple. Purple is even worse. These are the hexes. Thankfully, there aren't as many of them. But again, it's hard to read the black text on the purple background. Now, interestingly, Nocturne, those I think were the worst cards. They also introduced the best contrast. The night cards have white text on a solid black background and are some of the easiest cards in the whole Dominion family to read. So Nocturne introduced both the good and the bad in terms of contrast being very good and also being very bad. So we highly recommend playing in very bright light. And if you're having trouble reading any of it, getting a magnifier or a device that can turn it black and white for that better contrast, that would be really good.
Yeah. Another accessibility issue we want to put up, there is a lot of card shuffling because this is a deck builder. So if you have mobility issues with your hands, be prepared to either have your card shuffler on hand or some other device, or however you deal with lots of card shuffling, because there is going to be quite a bit of it in this game.
And the challenge is you start off with 10 cards in your deck, and it will grow from there. But some expansions allow you to trash cards, so then it'll get smaller. So shuffling 10 to 20 cards for a majority of the game can be very challenging. So however you do it, just be prepared that you're going to be shuffling a lot in this game. I think I mentioned a couple times that earlier printings have smaller text. So if you get newer printings, then it shouldn't be as bad on that. But for what it does right, a lot of the information is open. All the stacks are face up. So if you're having trouble with any of the reading, someone can read a card to you. Additionally, for how Will and I play it, we just play it open-handed.
Yeah, there's a lot in this game that has no reason to not be open-handed.
Yeah, there could, and there have been some instances of timing, but even when there's attack cards, even when there's reaction cards, the reactions don't necessarily respond to the attacks.
No, sometimes a reaction card is based on when you gain a card or when you do something else. That's when it plays, not when it's being attacked. So even those situations, open-handed is fine.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, he draws his cards at the end of his turn, unless somebody plays an attack card and we know he has a card in his deck that responds to it. I don't look at his hand until it's the beginning of his turn, and by that point, I can't do anything to him. So it's not like I could prepare. And even if I have an attack card and I know that he has a reaction card, most likely I'm still going to play the attack card because there's still a benefit to the rest of the card, even if it doesn't necessarily attack you.
Yeah, well, a lot of reaction cards don't stop the attack either.
Right.
They just happen to do something else.
Right, like you could draw cards or put something on top of your deck. So it reacts, but except for like the early expansions that might actually prevent an attack, a lot of them don't actually prevent.
I can only think of one card that does that. So.
Yeah. So there is that. And I think I should have kept this, but the night card, again, high contrast, one of the best contrasts. So that's where they got the text contrast very well. But
and again, like you said, the newer versions, larger print.
Right.
Yeah.
So, text heavy, generally speaking, so just be prepared for that. I think that wraps us up.
All right. So for 2 players,
Yes.
would you recommend this?
Yes. I mean, unless you really want a high player interaction game, in which case I would probably recommend something else, because even with the attack cards in here, they don't feel the most high player interaction. So overall, it's a great experience at 2.
I would say it's great for 2 players, but I would actually disagree with Sarah.
Oh.
In fact, the amount of player interaction is all dependent on what you have to play with. In other words, how many of the different expansions you have and what you put into it.
It's true.
So you can actually customize to be the most interactive experience you've ever had on the table, to the point where you're like, how about we play a solo game next? and that's all dependent on how you build it. Of course, when it comes to Dominion, the recommendation is that you play with maybe 1 expansion or 2 combined. Yeah. And the reason why they do that is because a lot of times different expansions will explore different areas of play space. Like, for example, this one deals with deck manipulation. This one deals with trashing. This will deal with choice. This one will deal with so on. So in order to get more depth out of that experience, they have more cards that synergize with that mechanism.
Right.
That they're
For example,
exploring.
I couldn't imagine playing with Nocturne and only having 1 Knight card in the 10 cards that you set up for the kingdom.
Yeah.
That just be like, oh, we're just going to blink and it's morning again because night just really didn't happen.
Yeah,
And
it just flattens the experience.
yeah. So yes, you can play 1 card from 10 different expansions if you want. And there are times where that would probably be okay if you picked what I would call more basic cards that just deal with the basic deck manipulation. It'd probably be okay, but you wouldn't really get to dive deep, as he said, into the, the variety mechanic or the big money mechanic or, those type of things.
Yeah, and so especially for a 2-player game, I would say have both players sit down and draft. Draft which cards you want to play with. So Sarah gets a pick, I get 2 picks. Sarah gets 2 picks. And do the snake draft until each player has picked 5 cards, because you have only play with 10 unique cards at any time. But then again, with expansions, that can actually balloon with support cards.
Right. There are non-supply card stacks.
But we'll get into that when we
Yes.
hit those installments.
Right.
But yes for a 2-player, no for what Sarah says.
Okay, you can make the game what you want, because that's the brilliant aspect of Dominion.
Accessibility now.
Accessibility, for the most part, I recommend this. If you do have mobility issues with shuffling and you don't have a way to help you with that, and or you might have some more severe vision issues, and again, you don't have some way to help with that, those are the 2 aspects where I would probably say this is not going to be a great game for you.
Yes, totally agree with Sarah for this.
Woohoo, I won.
That those extreme cases are probably where this game is not for you.
Right.
All other cases, this is a very accessible game.
Yes, I agree.
So that will do it for us. Remember to check out this Friday for our Rolling With series, where we actually talk about each individual installment, and also look for Board Game Theater, where I perform the flavor text of each installment. So, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, found this helpful, wants to do all those social media things, they can reach us at
Rolling With 2, that's TWO. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And on YouTube, please like and subscribe.
And why would you ever roll with just one when you can be rolling with 2?